Good evening, everyone. My name is Raymond Wool, and I'm the president of the Burger Park Advisory Council. It's a group of neighbors who volunteer to make our culture center a little more robust, reach out to the community, raise funds to help restore our mansions and create some programming. I was a Chicago public school teacher for 25 years. I had a choice when I retired. Well, I get involved in the schools, in the parks, or in our libraries. I'm a little bit involved in all of them. Anyways, it's not about me tonight, it's about all of us. Welcome. We are so delighted to be starting our On the Edge series. It's a lot of great energy came together. Met Larry during the campaign, and he walked around Burger Park and I said, how can we get you involved? And after an hour of walking through the whole grounds, this idea came and said, I think that have a speaker series. I imagine some forward-thinking civic leaders, educational leaders, taking us into the future. With all the research they're doing, with all the energy of the young people, I think I'm going to invite thought leaders from Northwestern, Loyola, and all the way down to his school, whatever university in Chicago. So it grew. What should we call it? And On the Edge. And I want to thank Justin Sherman, who did a design for that, and will carry on well beyond. And I want to thank the Friends of the Park, whose little seed grant helped the whole process too, and will be some refreshments after the event. We want to talk to each other instead. But without further ado, I'd like to, the person who created this whole series, Larry Spivak, let's welcome him. He's a marvelous thought leader himself, bringing the whole next generation of the University of Chicago and our community together.
Thanks, Ray, for that really nice introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Larry Schwabak. Nice to meet you all. We haven't met already. As Ray said, I did a tour of the grounds after I finished my aldermanic campaign, and I was really excited to try and bring some of my passions together, research and civic engagement. And so I'm just so excited to be here for our inaugural speaker series for On the Edge. I want to just say a few words about kind of the moment we're living in, though, because I think it really gives context to what we're doing here. Some of you may know that we're living through a very tumultuous time in American higher education, even honestly in secondary education. College has become increasingly expensive. You know, the cost of college has ballooned over the past 2 decades, even though attendance has remained about the same. And there's been declining support from public institutions, from the government, especially for higher ed. At the same time, attendance has kept pace. The working conditions of educators in universities has increasingly become adjuncts, lecturers, people who are not there to do research at least part of the time. And that's because of a number of forces, structural adjustments happening in higher ed, but also because of the political environment. There's been a kind of resurgence of anti-intellectualism in American society. We've seen a number of bills passed or are trying to be passed through states across the United States saying what you can and can't teach. That includes colleges, trying to control what's happening in classrooms. And amid this turmoil, I really want On the Edge to be a kind of counterweight to the idea that institutions of higher learning are distant, alienating, useless, unhelpful. We ought to be inheritors, I believe, of the progressive era, when there was this wonderful idea that research institutions were at the center of the community, and we're supposed to be working on all sorts of social and political problems. To put it in the words of Jennifer Ratner-Rosenhagen, who's a historian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, late 19th and early 20th century intellectuals were never content merely to just observe social problems in the world. They felt like they had to go out and do something about the world. Even those with cushy endowed chairs at the time, they regularly ventured into their communities, they engaged in local and state politics, and they frequented public libraries and union halls. This was an embodiment of what became known as the Wisconsin idea because of the president of the University of Wisconsin, who was famous for touting it. And I bring up this brief history not only to say, there's a lot of ways that we're falling short right now from this grand grand ideal of the late 19th and early 20th century, but also to say that I'm very optimistic because I look around and all the folks who showed up today to have Professor Forestal here, just reminds me that there still is that kind of urge, that aspiration to live out the Wisconsin ideal. I want to also just end before I introduce our guests by saying I hope you'll join us for future events. Please tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell your family. We'll be meeting here the second Tuesday of the month through March. The only exception is we're taking November off. So November, there will not be one. So you can show up here and still hang out, but we won't be here. Now I would like to turn our attention to tonight's lecture. I'm delighted that our first speaker not only comes from my own discipline of political science, but is also a political theorist, as I am. Professor Jeni Forestal is the Helen Houlihan Regali Assistant Professor of Political Science at Loyola University Chicago. Her research draws from the history of political thought to investigate the consequences of digital technologies for democratic practice. She has published in several academic and public-facing journals, including the flagship of our discipline, American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, Contemporary Political Theory, the Washington Post Monkey blog for those who follow politics closely. Professor Forestal's first book was released by Oxford University Press just last year, titled Designing for Democracy: How to Build Community in Digital Environments. The book argues that we must study how the built environment of digital spaces structures our activity, shapes our attitudes, and supports the kinds of relationships that democracies require. Professor Forestal holds a bachelor's from The Ohio State University and a master's and PhD from Northwestern University. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much first to Ray and Larry for inviting me, and all of you for being here at 6:30 on a Tuesday. I am 25 weeks pregnant and taught this morning, so I'm going to sit for most of this, unless you all have a problem with that. So I am looking forward today to sharing some of my work with you on the role of public shaming in a democratic life, why it sometimes works, why it oftentimes doesn't. And really the implications of sort of what this means for online public shaming in particular, which is becoming sort of an issue these days. So just to get sort of the background, in recent years, I think it seems like every time we kind of turn around or open our internet browsers or newspapers, we see that there's a new example of the internet being used to shame people for violating social norms. And these norms can range from like very serious ones to very superficial ones. For example, some that you might have heard of, or not. In 2005, we had the quote-unquote dog poop girl who refused to clean up after her dog on a train in South Korea, and was after her picture was posted to the internet, and she was shamed for it afterwards. Her name was publicized. I'm pretty sure she lost her job. To Justine Sacco in 2013, who tweeted a racist joke about South Africa and was also fired by the end of her flight to South Africa. To the two software developers who were fired after making sexist jokes at a tech conference after, again, their pictures were publicized on Twitter. To, more recently, Amy Cooper's publicized meltdown as the Central Park Karen in 2020. I'm sure you could all come up with your own examples. This is just a few. The result of all of this is, as one open letter put it, that the, quote, free exchange of information and ideas is daily becoming more constricted, and that censoriousness is spreading more widely in our culture, as evidenced by, among other things, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism. In other words, as assigned by a bunch of like public intellectuals and newspaper editors and journalists and things, professors. And really, I think what they're arguing is that this kind of online shaming, or sometimes what's called cancel culture, is something that's been ushered in by social media and the internet, and is a fundamental problem for democratic life, right? It is a problem for society. The question I'm going to pose today is like, is it really a problem for society? And is there a role for shame in a democracy? And if there is, then how can we make sure that online shamings actually fulfill that role, rather than being just kind of exercises in harassment and unjust firings or punishments? So that's what we'll talk about today. So I'll first say a few words to outline the conditions under which public shaming might be a valuable way to sanction social norm violations. I'll then turn to the example of Amy Cooper. Again, this is the Central Park Karen, to make the case that online public shaming oftentimes doesn't work. But it doesn't work not because the scale of the internet is so big, as many people believe, but rather because of the ways that people are organized using social media platforms. In other words, the kind of relationships that the platforms form between users. To show you that I'm right, or try and convince you, I will discuss another case where online public shaming did actually work productively to help govern a functioning democratic community online, and then I'll just conclude with some thoughts, and you can all tell me how I'm wrong about all the things I'm about to tell you. In short, what I'm arguing today, or what I will argue today, is that the problems with online public shaming that are absolutely there, and I don't want to minimize them, are not attributable to the scale of social media platforms, but rather to the kinds of relationships that these platforms invite between their users. And so I think ultimately there's a role for public shaming in democratic life, and I hope what I sort of lay out for you today can help us identify ways to effectively use public shaming, both online and off, as a form of democratic social control, rather than sort of stigmatization and harassment. So I think we probably all know what public shaming looks like, but just to be clear, what I'm focusing on here is a type of sanctioning practice that takes place between citizens. So it's when people engage in public moral criticism in response to violations or perceived violations of social norms. So the goal of public shaming is twofold. First, it works to motivate individual behavioral change by instilling feelings of shame or guilt in the person who's doing the norm violation, encouraging them to accept responsibility and take reparative action, right? It makes us feel bad for like violating some sort of kind of norm. But it also helps to reinforce the norms by acting as a deterrent against norm violations by others, right? So when somebody is publicly shamed, we hope that not only they will change their behavior as an individual, but everyone around them will be like, I don't want to be shamed either, so I'm not going to do that in the future. And it can be really valuable as a form of social control because precisely it's horizontal. It consists of citizens holding one another to account, even and especially in cases where there's no recourse to formal authority, right? So there might be some sort of like social norms in public life that we like want everybody to abide by, but we like don't think are important enough to like put them in jail or get them arrested, right? Or get them fined, right? There's just like, just please don't be a jerk, but we don't really want to punish you for it. And so public shaming is really, really good for those kinds of norm violations. So if you think about it this way, public shaming is one potentially valuable way to ensure that people adhere to, for example, democratic norms of equality, and to ensure that they do not engage in norm violations of things like, for example, hate speech, right? Where again, we might not be comfortable making that an actual offense where we get fined or punished by the state, but we don't really want people to be doing it anyway. We know from empirical research that public shaming actually works really, really well at getting people to adhere to social norms. But we also know that while shame can serve an important role in providing this kind of social sanction, it doesn't always do this. There's a lot of evidence from like psychology and other social sciences that shame punishments can not only misfire, but also backfire, right? There are times when it can lead to the person being shamed, not actually atoning for what they did and apologizing, but actually sort of disengaging from the community and resenting the fact that they were shamed in the first place. So as a sort of good social scientist, the question that we have to ask is, what influences whether public shaming succeeds or fails? And scholars have identified, I think, really 4 conditions required for effective public shaming to take place. I will run through them for you. So the first is the existence of shared norms. For public shaming to work as a method of social sanction, it requires that like we all agree that there are norms and we have to agree on what those norms are. So the person being shamed and the person doing the shaming have to be on the same page about like what the problem is and why it's a problem for the community. In addition, for public shaming to effectively sanction norm violations, it's not enough that the norms just exist. We also have to all recognize that the people doing the shaming have the authority to sanction the behaviors of the shamed, right? So in other words, I have to actually recognize that you have the authority to tell me what to do, and otherwise you're just going to be a person who's yelling at me for no reason whatsoever. Without these first two things, public shaming is likely to fail, right? And so it's when these two things are missing that we oftentimes see what some scholars call a shame backlash, right? When a person oversteps their boundaries or their authority and gets shamed for actually trying to shame someone else. In addition to recognizing the shamer's authority to sanction shared norms, effective public shaming also depends on the presence of what is oftentimes called reputational considerations on the part of the shamed. Again, this is pretty straightforward. It just means that, like, since public shaming is a punishment that depends solely on your reputation, you have to care about your reputation for it to have any effect whatsoever. If you don't care what people think of you, public shaming is not going to work. And then finally, for public shaming to work as a form of social control, rather than a process of stigmatization, harassment, or worse, it has to occur in a context where there's the possibility of again, what scholars call reintegration. And what really this means is that there has to be the opportunity for the person who was shamed to atone for what they did wrong and be accepted back into the community without stigma, right? If you apologize, we'll just sort of like welcome you back and say, like, it's all good. If you don't have an opportunity to reintegrate into the community, it's, again, you're going to be sort of marked as deviant no matter what you do. And so the shaming is not going to actually get anywhere. And so I think we can think about these four things at work in if we think about the way that the quiet car on the metro works, or perhaps CTA during early morning commutes, so that one's a little iffier. But anyway, so in the metro quiet car, right, there are shared, though informal, norms of quietness. It's unlikely that you're going to get officially punished on the metro if you're like talking in the quiet car. It's just annoying, and people are going to get mad at you for it. The reason, so you'll get shushed, right? So the shushing is the public shaming. The reason why it works is that people tend to recognize each other's authority. We can all understand that we have a vested interest in the car being quiet. The person is violating that norm, and so we all have the responsibility or the authority to shame them for doing it. If public shaming is in this context is going to work, though, you need to be the kind of person who, again, cares what the other people on the train think about you. If you are just rude, or you don't care, or you're never going to see those people again, you're much more likely to like just continue being loud and obnoxious. And so this is more likely to happen in those kinds of situations when people don't have repeated interactions. So if you are regularly commuting with the same people over and over and over again, it's much more likely that you're going to care about what your reputation is, right? You're going to see them tomorrow, and so you don't want that interaction to be messed up because of what you did bad today. Finally, in the quiet car, oftentimes once you've apologized and you're quiet again, everyone just sort of goes about their business and like doesn't make it a big deal later on, right? So once the violation has been atoned for, you're welcomed back in the community. So again, public shaming works pretty well in these kinds of contexts. So again, there's a lot you can say about these four conditions, the way that shame sanctioning works more generally in democratic communities or spaces. I'm happy to talk about them in our discussion afterwards. But the question I want to focus on for the rest of the talk is the interesting one that I promised, which is, what does this mean for online shaming? So people tend to agree that online public shaming is a problem. Even those people who do think that there's a role for public shaming in democratic life, so even people who might be like, yeah, it works on the quiet car, but like on the internet, it doesn't. It's a mistake. They tend to agree that public shaming on sites like Twitter is just a step too far, right? It's like cancel culture run amok, and it's the internet's fault. In order to show why they think this and why I think they're wrong, I want to consider more closely the case of Amy Cooper. So Amy Cooper was, as I've mentioned before, the Central Park Karen who called the cops on a black birder, Chris Cooper, no relation, invoking his race after he asked her to leash her dog as the park's rules required. So she was absolutely in the wrong in this interaction. The Amy Cooper case is a pretty typical case of online public shaming. So what happens in these kinds of situations is that an individual's bad behavior, which is oftentimes racism or sexism related, but this is uploaded to social media, it begins to circulate, oftentimes aided by high follower accounts who retweeted and hashtags that begin to trend. The person's behavior becomes the subject of sort of intense scrutiny by everyone on the internet at the moment. And as part of this process of intense scrutiny, many times other users will dox the target of shaming, meaning that they're calling for sort of real-world punishments by revealing personal information like the target's name, their location, their employer, in Amy Cooper's case, where her dog came from, that they draw from other public accounts, right? So they're not sort of uncovering necessarily private information, they're just pulling together what's available on the internet. This is exactly what happened to Amy Cooper in May of 2020. So she was almost immediately identified by name, even though the original tweet didn't say her name, it just showed the video of the encounter. She was almost immediately identified by name. Her name became a trending Twitter topic, which meant it sort of went out to people who weren't originally seeing the tweet. And by the end of the day, she had lost her job. She had been forced to surrender her dog, which was adopted, and she was being charged with filing a false police report, which held some jail time attached to it. Instead of going to jail, she completed a restorative justice process and apologized to Christian Cooper, as well as to, more broadly, quote, everyone who was offended by what they saw. So far, so good, right? Like, the public shaming worked. She was called out for it. She apologized. Everyone moves on. Not so fast. A year later, it's pretty clear that Amy Cooper hadn't changed her behavior at all. So she, as of May 2021, was suing her former employer, alleging that she did not call the police because she's racist. She did these things because she was alone in the park and frightened to death after being selected as the next target of Christian Cooper, unquote. So rather than acknowledging the fact that she was censured and shamed for her behavior a year prior, we see a year later that Cooper is once again engaged in like precisely the kind of sort of racist dog whistling that she was called out for the first time. So the question here, I think, is like, what went wrong? Why didn't she take the shaming into account? Why didn't she think about it and change her behavior? Oftentimes, those people who argue that online public shaming is a problem, who would not be at all surprised at the outcome of this case, lay the blame on the scale of social media and the way that they introduce a sort of unprecedented scale into public life. And so the problem with online public shaming in this sense is that there's just too much of it, right? There's too many people that are doing the sanctioning. There's too many disparate sort of ideas about what proportional responses are. And so there's no proportional response available, right? And so it just always ends up blowing up into something huge and uncontrollable. And I want to argue that that's not, or at least not only, the problem here. What I want to try and convince you of is that it is actually the social structure of these online platforms rather than their scale that leads online public shaming to fail in cases like Amy Cooper's. And so the difference here is a small but meaningful one, and so I'm happy to like clarify if it's not going to come through clear when I say it the first time. So scale refers to the number of people involved in any kind of community, right? So you could have like a smaller scale that only has a few, or a large scale that has many. This is the shift then that people are mostly worried about when they talk about online public shaming. We're moving from like in-person communities that are pretty small and know each other, and we're moving to just an unprecedented sort of mass of people. What matters, structure, on the other hand, emphasizes the like relationships between the people involved. Like, do they all know each other or do they not know each other? And so what matters, I think, for online shaming or shaming more generally is whether or not the network is what is called open or what is called closed. Again, this is like real technical network stuff, so yeah. So an open network means that not everybody is connected to each other. So if you're the blue person, you have all of these connections to people, but the people that you're connected to are not connected to each other. When you, so now I'm teaching you, I'm like, does that make sense? When you have a closed network, right, you still have the same number of connections, but your connections are now connected to one another, right? And so it's a denser network. And so while small-scale networks are oftentimes denser, right, so when you have fewer people in a space, they tend to form more connections. This is just two conceptually distinct things, and I think it's important to keep them straight. And there are various institutional and environmental characteristics, things like a professional organization or a conference hall or a neighborhood, right, that make large-scale closed networks possible, right? Like, by virtue of the fact that there is a like Burger Park Advisory Council, it makes people think of themselves and form interactions that they might not otherwise do if they were just living next to each other. And so we can see the importance of structure by looking more closely at the case of Amy Cooper and Twitter. So the Cooper example, like many or most cases of online public shaming, takes place largely on Twitter. And Twitter is an open network, which is why this came up again. Unlike a platform like Facebook, most Twitter relationships are asymmetrical, meaning that they're unreciprocated. So the people I follow on Twitter might not follow me back and usually don't. And so the conversations or the relationships that happen on Twitter almost never look like this, which would be a closed network. They look something like this, where one person broadcasts to a lot of people that follow them but don't follow each other, or where a lot of people are tweeting at one person but not talking to each other. So these two, here you have two smaller groups that aren't talking to each other, and this basically only happens with like people who are at a conference or a concert or something, and so they're like all talking about the same thing but not necessarily talking to each other. Again, I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like, but the point of it is that Twitter is basically a very broad open network, and that is really, really politically valuable. That's why Twitter is so good for organizing collective action. It's why it's really good for marginalized groups and people to help find each other and amplify their perspective, but it is not very good for public shaming to work. The open structure of Twitter makes it difficult, for example, for users to cultivate a sense of shared norms. There's just like so much going on and no one is connected that they don't share the sense of values that are necessary. They don't have a sense of collective authority. So like even if I have a sense of what norm violations I'm looking out for, the people that I'm talking to might not share that and so don't care what I think. I have no authority to sanction them. Because of its open network, Twitter users are unlikely to develop the kind of reputational considerations that they need for shame to work, right? Like, why do you care what people on Twitter think about you? You probably don't, and you have every reason not to. And finally, even if users do want to atone for their misbehavior on Twitter, right? Even if Amy Cooper did want to actually apologize to the people that were offended by her tweet, there's no way to do that, right? They're just like a bunch of random people who are disconnected. It's not like she can go to the organization or go to a single room that they'll all be in and talk to all of them. And so you can't be reintegrated into a community if the community doesn't exist. And so I think this helps explain the Cooper case because the shaming that Amy Cooper faced wasn't really collective sanctioning, which is what public shaming is or should be, right? It's not the whole quiet car saying, shut up. It's just a bunch of random people talking to her in that sense of like she's in the middle and everyone's tweeting at her. And so it's more like an aggregation of individual opinions with nothing tying them together. And so the result is, I think, that it's not clear why she should have cared about what Twitter users thought of her. It's not clear who she needed to satisfy or what she needed to do to satisfy people in order to be reintegrated into the community. And so we shouldn't be surprised at the result, right? That she was stigmatized, she was harassed, and she just ended up sort of backfiring entirely instead of being productive. Okay. So that's step one. It doesn't work on Twitter. Just because Twitter is badly designed for public shaming doesn't mean that this is true for all of the internet or even all of social media. And in fact, I think there's a lot of really interesting examples of well-functioning digital platforms whose users can and do use public shaming in productive ways. So Wikipedia is a good example that we can certainly talk about, but I'm not going to talk about now. These ultimately use public shaming, and there's a lot of examples of this, so they can sort of help contribute to a public good, so building something like Wikipedia to motivate the kind of critical self-reflection, so it sort of change users' minds about what is appropriate behavior or not. And so I will conclude by highlighting one of these examples, which is Reddit. So Reddit was founded, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar, but Reddit was founded in 2005. It's a popular link sharing website. It has about 330 million monthly active users. They gather in about 140,000 subreddits organized around a variety of topics. These topics range wildly, so they vary from things like cute animals to politics to NBA teams. They're all sort of focused around common interests, from very popular interests like movies to very niche interests like political philosophy, political theory. Reddit is also a community that maintains itself largely through the existence and enforcement of informal social norms. So there's again, no real Reddit police, there's no real Reddit admins or moderators, they're all sort of within the community moderating themselves. And it works. And I want to argue or highlight how this effective norm enforcement is tied again to the way that Reddit sort of forms relationships between its users in a way that is totally unlike that of Twitter. So subreddits, this is the Chicago subreddit. Subreddits are the spaces that you go to interact with other people on Reddit. They are discrete spaces. They act like neighborhoods, and so they help form closed networks with their users. Within subreddits, there are clearly expressed norms that are shared among users. These, again, are the rules for our Chicago. Other Redditors' authority to sanction the rules is sort of built into the platform. So not only do people acknowledge that they have the authority to do so, but you can sort of up and down vote both people and comments to sort of use your authority to sanction or not what people are posting on your community. Reputation matters a great deal on Reddit. You can see somebody's reputation sort of quantified in something called karma. So Redditors gain karma when they do good things on the platform, meaning like they get upvoted or they sort of get awards or something, so people recognize that they've done something that's worthy of praise. They lose karma when their content or posts are downvoted or otherwise sanctioned. And users' karma is displayed on their profile. So you can see on like Governor Schwarzenegger's, the numbers are right there. They lose karma, you can immediately see how someone is being received on the platform. Like there's a sort of badge that follows you around. And so in short, Reddit's closed network structure, which is facilitated by this like subreddit design that's sort of grouped around communities of interest, makes public shaming sanctions more effective because it provides those 4 social conditions that I talked about earlier. And this means that public shamings on Reddit play out really differently. And so I will end with another example to show you. In 2012, a Reddit user aptly named European Douchebag posted a picture to rfunny. I could not have planned it better. That's actually his handle. Posted a photo of rfunny of a Sikh woman with untrimmed facial hair. So he posted it with the expectation that the other 2.5 million members of the community would find it funny along with him. The post gained national media attention, however, and other commenters began to shame European Douchebag for violating the norms of rfunny, right? That like this is not an appropriate thing to post in that space. No one else sort of found it funny. After first doubling down on his original position, European Douchebag later apologized, saying in a separate post, quote, "rfunny wasn't the proper place to post this. Maybe our racism or our douchebags of Reddit or our intolerance would have been more appropriate." It's a much longer apology than that, but that's something to highlight. And so in this example, I think we can see European Douchebag not only apologizing, but also doing so in a way that clearly identifies how he violated the specific norms of the community that he was posting in. He also recognizes his fellow Redditors' authority to sanction his actions, right? He's sort of acknowledging like, you all were right to call me out for doing this because it wasn't appropriate to do in this space. We can contrast his really specific apology in this moment with Cooper's apology, which is really vague and was aimed at, quote, everyone who's seen the video, everyone who's been offended, and everyone who thinks of me in a lower light. Right? It's not clear from her apology what she's apologizing for. It's not clear who she's apologizing to, and so on. European Douchebag's post also reveals the importance of his reputation to him. He notes in a couple posts that he made the original like photo post for stupid internet points. That's his quote. And he later comments in this passage that he hopes you guys, meaning the other Redditors, won't remember me as that douchebag that posted the picture of the Sikh girl. And the community responds pretty productively. So while there are plenty of people who remained skeptical that he actually meant his apology, interestingly, they are like, you wouldn't have apologized if you weren't called out, which is sort of saying like you were only apologizing because you were shamed, which is sort of recognizing that the shaming was effective. But most of the Redditors who were commenting on this post were really pretty applauding him for apologizing. They recognized the fact that he atoned for his norm violation and sort of welcomed him back into the community as an equal. And so when we compare European Douchebag's experience to the Cooper case, we can see, I think, some striking similarities and differences. So both of them involved a private 2-person interaction that ultimately made national news and resulted in shamings on 2 large-scale social media platforms. But beyond that, the social context varied pretty dramatically between the 2. On Reddit, the shaming occurred within a closed network facilitated by the platform's subreddit design. It's a community-based website, and that has an effect. And as a result, European Douchebag was able to contextualize his shaming as a response from a cohesive community of which he was a member, and he responded in exactly the way we would hope to see somebody respond to public shaming. For Amy Cooper, on the other hand, the shaming was conducted within the open network structure of Twitter, where it was less clear who was doing the shaming, for what purpose she was being shamed, and why she should care about it, right? The community context, the collective action aspect of it was missing. And so again, we shouldn't be surprised that the shaming wasn't effective. And so I think by attending to the social structure, the kind of relationship between those involved, we can see that the salient difference between these cases is not reducible to scale, right? Both of them are talking about millions of members involved. It's really about the structure, the relationships that are formed with and on these platforms. I don't really have a ton of concluding thoughts, except to say I'm more interested in hearing from you all. But I think as a political theorist, a lot of sort of what we do is try to clarify some of the public debates that we're having. And I think that the conversation around public shaming and cancel culture more generally is just really messy these days. And so what I sort of hope to provide with this work and other work that I do is to give us some clarity about what it is that we're arguing about, right? That there are times when I think shaming is helpful and useful and we might want to save it. We just have to remember that shaming is context dependent and it's not appropriate for all contexts. And once we recognize that, we can start thinking about strategies for using online public shaming effectively, right? Part of the reason why it's so effective on Reddit and not on Twitter is because there are very clearly articulated norms that the users of Reddit share. And that is not the case on Twitter. So is there a way that you could import something to sort of make shared norms on Twitter more evident to users? That's a possible way to try and make shaming more effective on that platform. I don't know if it would work, but we can certainly try it, right? I think that it just sort of gives us a variety of options rather than just saying shaming is never okay and we should just stop, because clearly it does work sometimes and we can sort of think about that. So I will leave it there and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thanks.
So as we transition over to question and answer, there's 3 teachers running this program tonight, but I'd love you to just turn to a neighbor, turn to someone maybe that you know or don't know, and let's take a minute and a half, and maybe talk a little bit about what you thought was interesting or something that you thought was curious about still, or that you feel was left unanswered before we move into the formal Q&A, if that makes sense.
Or that you think is wrong.
Or that you think is wrong. But let's take a minute and a half and kind of introduce yourselves to each other. If you don't know the person sitting next to you.